Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. When I examine Donald Trump's recent remark that his peace plan for Ukraine is not his final offer, I see far more than a passing comment or a negotiator's flourish. I see an aperture, a small but revealing opening into the worldview that animates U.S. policy debates today. And as someone who has spent decades trying to interpret how major powers maneuver in moments of global tension, I recognize this as a quintessential moment of strategic ambiguity. It is the language of someone who wants room to maneuver, room to redefine the political landscape, room to reshape the expectations of allies and adversaries alike. Trump's statement carries within it the DNA of his political style, the deliberate refusal to set boundaries, the intentional creation of uncertainty, the insistence that any proposal is merely the starting point of a larger, more personal negotiation. In his world, a peace plan is never a peace plan. It is leverage. It is a bargaining chip. It is a performance of power. And it is designed, above all, to keep the other actors, Kyiv, Moscow, Brussels, and even Washington itself, off balance. When I look at the essence of Trump's remark, I see three core impulses at play. The first is the desire for personal authorship of a geopolitical victory. Trump needs to claim that only he can end the war in 24 hours. This is not just rhetoric. It is the foundation of his political brand. The plan must be unfinished because its final contours must appear to emerge from his own will, his own improvisation, his own theatrical moment. That is why he emphasizes that nothing is final. To finalize something would be to surrender the performance, the bargaining leverage, the narrative of personal mastery. The second impulse is the drive to shift burdens away from the United States, especially financial burdens. When Trump says his offer is not final, he is signaling that costs, military, economic, political, can be renegotiated. In his logic, Ukraine must become less of an American responsibility and more of a European one. His statement is therefore not simply directed at Kyiv. It is a message to Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, and Brussels. Prepare to carry more because Washington, under my leadership, will carry less. By rendering the plan provisional, Trump widens the space for pressing Europe to absorb additional responsibilities. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Trump's ambiguity creates the preconditions for potential concessions to Russia, concessions that he is not yet prepared to publicly articulate. By leaving his proposal open-ended, he keeps the door ajar for outcomes that deviate significantly from current Western policy outcomes that might involve the freezing of territorial lines, the tacit acceptance of Russian gains, or a negotiated neutrality arrangement for Ukraine. Whether one considers these concessions prudent realism or abandonment depends greatly on one standpoint, but the structure of Trump's language undeniably allows them. As I reflect on this dynamic, I also see the risks clearly. Ukraine is not merely a chess piece, it is a sovereign nation fighting for survival. When a major power frames its peace plan as provisional, flexible, revisable at will, it generates profound uncertainty in Kyiv. Ukrainian leaders are left wondering whether their sacrifices will be exchanged in some larger geopolitical bargain. And the more ambiguous Washington becomes, the more Moscow senses opportunity. In my view, Trump's not final remark is less about diplomacy and more about positioning himself against the Biden administration, positioning the United States against Europe, and positioning Washington in a way that gives Russia just enough hope to stay engaged. It reflects a world order in transition, a moment in which the United States can no longer dictate outcomes, but can still disrupt them. The task ahead for Ukraine and for Europe is to navigate this ambiguity without being consumed by it. At first glance, Trump's evolving posture toward Ukraine seems erratic at times, supportive at times, dismissive, and almost always framed around his personal ability to end the war quickly. To understand the strategic core behind this rhetoric, one must look beyond the theatrics. Trump, unlike traditional diplomats, does not anchor his worldview in institutions, international law, or long-term regional architectures. Instead, he operates through a transactional logic shaped by short-term political incentives, domestic pressures, and the pursuit of symbolic victories that can be easily communicated to the American electorate. From this vantage point, Trump's insistence that his peace plan is not final reflects more than tactical ambiguity. It reflects a deeper set of goals, some overt, others implied, that reveal where he intends to push Ukraine and how he imagines recalibrating America's role in the conflict. The first and most visible of these goals is burden shifting. Trump has long argued that the United States pays too much for European security. In his worldview, the war in Ukraine is fundamentally a European problem, one created by geography, exacerbated by NATO politics, and financed disproportionately by Washington. Thus, when he leaves his plan deliberately unfinished, he is signaling to Europe that a second Trump administration would transfer greater responsibility to Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, and Brussels. The message is simple. If Europe wants Ukraine defended, Europe must pay for it. As Trump continues to test political waters, this message becomes clearer. A future settlement in his framing should reduce American obligations while maintaining American influence. That creates a paradox. How can the United States maintain geopolitical leverage while decreasing strategic investment? Here is where his broader approach becomes visible. Trump's second objective is political optics, the need to produce a deliverable for American voters. He wants a peace that can be packaged as a personal achievement, not the result of alliances or diplomacy. For this reason, the plan cannot be final because the negotiation itself is part of the spectacle. It must feel improvised, dramatic, and anchored in Trump's own persona. To finalize it too early would deprive him of the narrative payoff. There would be no moment of triumphant revelation, no deal that he alone could claim credit for. His third implicit objective is more controversial, a quiet concession to Russia in exchange for stability. Trump's rhetoric repeatedly suggests that he views Ukraine's maximalist war aims not Russia's aggression as the primary obstacle to peace. In this logic, the way forward is not through military victory, but through settlement, not through restoring pre-2014 borders, but through compromise, and not through NATO expansion, but through neutrality. This is where the shift from third person to first person becomes essential, because the deeper I analyze this dynamic, the more I observe a pattern I have seen throughout my career. Many American leaders, especially those without a deep grounding in Eastern European history, assume that stability can be purchased through territorial concessions. They see borders as negotiable sovereignty, as flexible, and geopolitical crises as problems to be traded away in exchange for short-term calm. I have witnessed this mindset before in the Balkans and the Middle East, and in earlier chapters of U.S.-Russia relations. But Ukraine is not merely another bargaining chip. And this is where I must speak clearly in the first person. I believe that Trump underestimates the profound structural forces shaping the war. Ukraine is not fighting only for land. It is fighting for its identity, its agency, and its right to exist outside the sphere of Russian domination. No amount of transactional bargaining can override those historical realities. Trump's approach, if carried forward, would push Ukraine toward adaptive concession, the acceptance of a ceasefire that freezes territorial lines, perhaps indefinitely. From Trump's perspective, this quick peace would be a win-cost fall, U.S. commitments shrink, and the war ceases to be a political liability. But from Ukraine's perspective, it may be a trap, a frozen conflict that leaves the country vulnerable, economically strained, and forced into a defensive crouch. Europe, too, faces consequences. A United States that steps back from Ukraine or that pressures Kyiv into settlements favorable to Moscow will shift the burden of European security entirely onto the EU. I believe Europe is not yet fully prepared for this outcome. Its defense industries remain fragmented, its political will divided, and its strategic imagination constrained by decades of U.S. leadership. In short, Trump's final plan is not a diplomatic experiment. It is a strategic pivot, one that seeks to redraw the map of responsibilities, reshape America's involvement, and redefine what the West considers acceptable in Ukraine. And the world must be prepared for the consequences. From the outside, Trump's evolving rhetoric on Ukraine looks like improvisation. But within the deeper architecture of great power politics, his positioning aligns with a broader school of thought in Washington, the belief that Ukraine cannot fully defeat Russia militarily and that the United States should therefore push Kyiv toward what some call a realistic settlement. In Trump's hands, this becomes a far more volatile strategy, one driven less by sober analysis and more by intuition, political instinct, and the desire to distinguish himself from establishment thinking. Yet when one examines his signals carefully, the trajectory becomes clear. Trump is preparing the ground for concessions to Russia, though he avoids stating them explicitly. This is the subtext behind his statement that his peace plan is not final. The indeterminacy is deliberate. It allows him to adjust, escalate, or retreat depending on the political moment. It also allows him to explore outcomes that would currently be unacceptable to Kyiv or to much of Europe without publicly committing to them. In the strategic vocabulary of diplomacy, such flexibility is a warning sign. It suggests a willingness to deviate from established Western goals, including the full restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. As I shift into first person, I must say this plainly. I have seen this pattern many times before. When leaders begin speaking in the language of realism, it often becomes a euphemism for accepting the gains of military aggression after the fact. In the Balkans, in portions of Africa, in the geopolitics of the Middle East, territorial revisionism has often been rewarded under the guise of stability, and I fear the same logic is emerging here. Trump's approach rests on four pillars. First, he tends to view Russia not as an ideological adversary, but as a negotiable power, one with whom deals can be made. This is not inherently wrong. Dialogue with Moscow is necessary, but Trump's method often underestimates the structural and historical dimensions of Russian strategy. For the Kremlin, Ukraine is not simply bargaining material. It is a civilizational question. A weak or neutralized Ukraine is central to Moscow's long-term vision. Trump, by framing the war in transactional terms, risks misreading Russia's deep motivations. Second, Trump's rhetoric suggests that he believes territorial compromise is inevitable, that Ukraine ultimately cannot regain all occupied lands, and that pushing for total victory is unrealistic. Whether one agrees with this assessment or not, it is clear that his language prepares Washington for outcomes far closer to Moscow's preferences than Kyiv's. Third, Trump's broader foreign policy instinct is to avoid long-term commitments. He sees Ukraine as a drain on U.S. finances, a distraction from domestic priorities, and a conflict Europe should be handling on its own. In this worldview, the incentives all point toward a quick settlement, even if that settlement entrenches Russian control. Fourth, and perhaps most consequential, Trump frames the war not as a defining struggle for European security, but as a burdensome dispute between regional actors. This minimizes the systemic consequences of a Russian victory. And I say this as clearly as I can. The collapse of Ukraine's sovereignty would reverberate across Europe in ways that cannot be undone. it would weaken the credibility of Western security guarantees, embolden revisionist actors globally, and deepen Europe's long-term vulnerability. Russia understands this dynamic far better than Trump acknowledges. In Moscow's eyes, Trump's openness to revisions of his peace plan signals exactly what the Kremlin wants to hear, that American resolve is flexible and that U.S. policy may bend toward accepting de facto Russian control. This perception, even if partly illusory, has consequences. It encourages Russia to prolong the conflict, anticipating a more favorable negotiating partner in Washington. Europe, meanwhile, watches this unfolding with growing alarm. If Washington shifts toward a softer line, Europe will face a dilemma it has not confronted in decades: either escalate its support to fill the gap or accept a settlement that leaves Russia strengthened. For countries on NATO's eastern flank, this is not merely theoretical, it is existential. And Ukraine, perhaps the most vulnerable actor in this equation, faces the risk of being reduced to a bargaining chip in a geopolitical negotiation that ignores its agency, its sacrifices, and its democratic aspirations. As I reflect on this, I return to the central question: is Trump quietly conceding to Russia? My answer, not explicitly. But all the underlying signals, the ambiguity, the pressure on Kyiv, the critiques of European undercontribution, the emphasis on ending the war quickly suggests that he is preparing precisely that pathway. And the consequences will shape Europe's security architecture for generations. Europe's position in the Ukraine conflict has always been structurally fragile, geographically exposed, economically intertwined with global supply chains, politically diverse, and strategically dependent on the United States for security assurances. Trump's ambiguous and increasingly Russia-tolerant posture forces Europe into a moment of reckoning. It must now confront a question it has postponed for decades: can Europe safeguard its own security if the United States shifts away from its traditional role? At first glance, Europe appears united behind Ukraine. Nearly every major capital has issued strong statements reaffirming Kyiv's sovereignty, condemning Russian aggression, and committing to long-term support. But beneath this surface lies a web of contradictions, economic pressures, domestic political divisions, and competing interpretations of what the endgame in Ukraine should look like. Trump's signals amplify these tensions. His framing of Ukraine as a European problem, combined with his openly transactional worldview, leaves Europe uneasy. If Washington reduces its commitment or worse pressures Kyiv into concessions, Europe faces the possibility of confronting a revanchist Russia without American leadership, and this is where the real geopolitical dilemma emerges. From the third-person analytical view, Europe is caught between war fatigue and security fear. On one side, war fatigue is real. Energy shocks, inflation, slowing growth, and rising budget deficits have strained nearly every major economy. Public support for Ukraine, while still strong, is no longer unanimous. Protest movements in Germany, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and parts of France reveal segments of the population questioning why their livelihoods should suffer because of a war many feel powerless to influence. On the other side, fear of a bad settlement, one that rewards Russian aggression, remains profound. For Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, and much of Scandinavia, a weakened Ukraine is a direct threat to national security. These countries do not view the conflict as distant. They see it as a buffer protecting them from a resurgent Russia. Europe is thus split between two strategic impulses: stabilize the economy or confront Russia decisively. As I shift into first person, I must say plainly, I believe Europe underestimated the long-term structural consequences of its security dependence on the United States. For decades, Europe assumed Washington would remain a reliable guarantor of stability, a constant force capable of deterring aggression and coordinating collective defense. But Trump's worldview and the political movement behind him exposes just how fragile this assumption has become. Trump sees NATO not as a strategic alliance, but as a cost imbalance. He views European security as something Europe should pay for, not something the United States should subsidize. Whether one agrees with him or not, his position forces Europe to confront a fundamental truth. Its military capacity remains insufficient for autonomous strategic. This is why Europe fears a Trump-Russia grand bargain. If Trump pressures Ukraine to accept territorial losses, and if he normalizes relations with Moscow on those terms, Europe's entire security architecture is shaken. The deterrence credibility of NATO would weaken. Russia would interpret concessions as validation of its strategy, and Europe would face a future in which the U.S. remains powerful, but no longer committed to the stability of the European continent. I have argued for decades that Europe needs to develop its own strategic autonomy, not as a rival to the United States, but as a mature partner. The Ukraine war exposes the cost of postponing this responsibility. Without stronger defense industry integration, without deeper political alignment, without sustainable long-term support mechanisms for Kyiv, Europe will struggle to respond effectively if Washington steps back. But Europe is not powerless. It remains an economic superpower, a regulatory powerhouse, and a region with immense technological potential. Its challenge is political, aligning its diverse interests into a coherent strategy. That requires reconciling Western European caution with Eastern European urgency and building a security framework that is resilient regardless of U.S. political cycles. In the end, Europe's dilemma is not only about Ukraine, it is about Europe's future identity. Will it remain dependent on Washington's shifting priorities, or will it rise to the responsibility history is now demanding of it? Ukraine now finds itself at the most precarious juncture of its modern history. After 2 years of war, enormous human loss, and the destruction of countless communities and infrastructures, Kyiv must navigate not only the brutality of Russian aggression, but the shifting political landscapes of Washington and Europe. Trump's ambiguous positioning, his not final peace plan, and hints of a settlement more favorable to Moscow pushes Ukraine into a strategic dilemma: how to maintain sovereignty and agency when the largest actors around it are preparing negotiations. Kyiv did not request. From the third-person frame, Ukraine's challenge is clear. It must hold its ground militarily while preventing its fate from being decided in rooms where it is not present. The danger of being reduced to a bargaining chip looms large. Every time Washington signals flexibility or Europe hesitates on long-term funding, Kyiv feels the tremors of geopolitical bargaining happening above its head. Zelensky's government has staked everything on a simple principle: territorial integrity cannot be traded away. Yet Trump's language implying Ukraine must be reasonable, must negotiate, must stop depending on U.S. money suggests a worldview fundamentally misaligned with Kyiv's existential struggle. This misalignment forces Ukraine to consider strategies far beyond the battlefield. One of these strategies is deepening integration with Europe. Even as the war continues, Ukraine's EU accession track advances. This is not just symbolic. EU membership or even accelerated integration would anchor Ukraine within a legal, political, and economic system that cannot be easily undone by a foreign power. It would provide protection against unilateral concessions Washington might pressure Kyiv to accept. Another strategy is diversifying security partnerships. The United Kingdom, Poland, the Baltic states, Canada, the Nordic countries, these nations tend to maintain a more uncompromising stance against Moscow than some Western European governments. They understand often from their own histories that frozen conflicts only postpone future wars. Ukraine knows it must secure bilateral and regional defense guarantees strong enough to survive shifts in U.S. politics. As I shift into first person, I want to emphasize something I have observed repeatedly across my decades of work in global conflict zones. A peace imposed from above is rarely sustainable. It collapses because it ignores the lived realities of the people on the ground. It fails because it prioritizes the convenience of great powers over the dignity of smaller nations. And it backfires because it rewards aggression and signals weakness. Ukraine, therefore, is right to fear a rapid theatrical settlement aimed more at providing a victory for Washington than actual long-term stability. But Ukraine must also confront its own structural vulnerabilities. The country remains deeply dependent on external financing, Western arms, and Western political cohesion. Trump's rhetoric exposes the fragility of this reliance. Kyiv must build institutions capable of weathering geopolitical turbulence, resilient industries, decentralized infrastructure, and a strengthened political system that can negotiate from a position of dignity, not desperation. There is also a psychological dimension. A nation at war for survival cannot simply accept being treated as a pawn. The collective trauma of invasion, occupation, and bombardment reshapes national consciousness. Ukraine will not easily accept a deal that legitimizes the suffering inflicted upon it. Any leader who tries risks losing legitimacy. This is why Ukraine's path is narrow but not hopeless. It lies between idealism, the belief in full restoration, and pragmatism, the need to secure security guarantees and economic survival, even under imperfect conditions. But above all, Ukraine must insist on agency. I have argued for years that long-term peace requires recognizing Ukraine not as a buffer state, not as a prize in a great power contest, but as a sovereign actor whose aspirations matter. Without this recognition, any settlement will be fragile, temporary, and morally hollow. Finally, Trump's statements should remind the world of a deeper truth. Geopolitical stability cannot depend on the personality of a single leader. Whether the U.S. remains supportive or shifts course, whether Europe stays unified or fractures, Ukraine must build a future grounded in political resilience, economic autonomy, and alliances broad enough to withstand change. Because if Ukraine's destiny is determined by external powers rather than its own people, then peace, no matter how quickly declared, will not last.